After years of grinding conflict, the path to peace in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Well, it's being forged in a really high-stakes series of meetings that just wrapped up. And they've revealed both, unexpected agreements and some pretty deep divisions.
Yeah, the diplomatic world has been absolutely buzzing this past week, a real flurry of critical meetings. First, we saw U.S. President Donald Trump meet Russian President Vladimir Putin up in Alaska August 15th. That summit hinted at some significant movement.
It really did. Hints, anyway.
Then, just days later, August 18th, President Trump brought together Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and a pretty powerful roster of European leaders right here in Washington, D.C. We're talking UK Prime Minister, the leaders of France, Germany, the EU Commission President.
A major gathering.
Absolutely. And what really grabbed headlines was Trump actually interrupting the White House talks to call Putin mid-meeting.
Yeah, that was something.
The main goal of all these urgent talks, trying to secure a lasting peace deal for Ukraine. But it's incredibly complex, isn't it? I mean, there's clearly this push for peace, but these deep disagreements, they're still there. Core issues like, will Ukraine have to give up territory? And what exactly are these security guarantees going to look like?
Right. We hear this phrase, Article 5-like protections. Sounds a bit like NATO's collective defense idea.
It does. It resembles it. But crucially, Europe seems poised to shoulder a very, very significant financial burden here. The stakes. They're just immense. It's not just Ukraine's futures. It impacts the whole security setup in Europe, maybe even the global order.
And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive. We want to look closely at the source material from these talks, try to cut through some of the noise, and really pull out the key bits of information to help you understand what's truly shaping the potential end to this awful conflict.
Yeah, we need to look at the main roadblocks to peace, what the major players are actually demanding, and, the huge financial and military commitments involved. Who's paying for what, basically?
Okay, so let's start with this urgent push for peace. It really seemed to pick up steam in August 2025, that Trump-Putin summit in Alaska on the 15th. That felt pivotal.
It did feel like a moment, yeah. Both leaders signaled some progress. And the really remarkable thing, potentially, is that Putin reportedly agreed to this Article 5-like protection for Ukraine, a security guarantee that sounds a lot like NATO's collective defense.
That sounds huge.
It is potentially huge. According to the special U.S. envoy, Steve Witkoff, Putin also committed that Russia wouldn't go after any other European countries. And Trump confirmed Putin agreed that Russia would accept security guarantees for Ukraine.
Okay, hold on. If Putin actually agreed to Article 5-like protection, I mean, that's almost unbelievable given Russia's long-standing, very vocal opposition to Ukraine joining anything Western.
Yeah.
How much weight should we really put on that statement?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? This Article 5-like commitment, as Witkoff called it, is game-changing, and it's a big if it holds up. For Russia to even hint at security guarantees for Ukraine, something they've resisted so fiercely. It suggests either a major strategic rethink in Moscow or, maybe it's a calculated diplomatic move to get concessions somewhere else.
So we shouldn't necessarily take it at face value just yet.
Exactly. The key insight isn't just the supposed agreement itself, but the motivation behind it. And how binding could it really be without a formal treaty? It opens a door, maybe, but it definitely doesn't slam shut the door on ambiguity. It's still quite murky.
That makes sense. Okay, so then just 3 days later, August 18th, you have this big meeting at the White House. Trump, Zelensky, Keir Starmer from the UK, Macron from France, Merz from Germany, Stubb from Finland, Maloney from Italy, NATO's Mark Rutte, the EU's Ursula von der Leyen. I mean, that's a powerful group.
A very powerful signal of, attempted unity at least.
And then we had that moment, Trump calling Putin directly during the meeting. Very hands-on, very unconventional diplomacy.
It was certainly bold, showcasing that direct line, perhaps. But even with that momentum, a key difference popped up almost immediately. Does a peace deal need a ceasefire first?
Right. President Trump was pretty explicit, wasn't he? I don't think you need a ceasefire. He mentioned other deals he'd settled while fighting was still going on.
Yeah, he argued that you can work out a peace deal while they're fighting. His concerns seemed to be that a ceasefire might just let the other side rebuild and rebuild, a strategic pause that could backfire.
So he sees a ceasefire potentially prolonging things. But Europe, they clearly feel differently.
And that's where you see the split. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz pushed back. He said, we would all like to see a ceasefire, and basically found it hard to imagine the next meeting happening without one. He urged pressure on Russia for it.
And analysts seem worried too.
They are. The argument is that a temporary ceasefire, without the whole deal settled, risks just freezing a dangerous situation. It could let hardliners on both sides regroup, and it would definitely hinder Ukraine's economic recovery and reforms, which are crucial.
What about Russia's take on the ceasefire timing?
Russia's line is that any ceasefire has to come after real progress in addressing the root causes of the war. So they're linking it to achieving their own objectives first.
Okay, that ceasefire debate really highlights the different strategic thinking. But let's dig deeper. Beneath that immediate question, what are the really tough, maybe even existential obstacles to any kind of lasting peace? It feels like we keep circling back to territory, security, and just basic truths.
Those are the core issues, absolutely.
Let's start with territory. Control and conceptions. What exactly is Russia demanding?
Well, Russia is insisting on full recognition of its control over Crimea, seized back in 2014, remember, and also the 4 Ukrainian provinces it illegally annexed in 2022: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. Putin has reportedly demanded Ukraine actually withdraw troops from the parts of those provinces Kyiv still holds. That's a condition for ending the war, from his perspective.
And Ukraine. Their position has always been firm. No giving up land.
Absolutely firm. President Zelensky has consistently ruled out handing over territory. He's pointed out that past concessions, like Crimea, were just used as a springboard for a new attack. So the trust isn't there.
But he has shown some flexibility.
He has expressed some openness, yes, to discussing territorial control based on where the front line is now. So acknowledging the current battlefield reality, maybe, but definitely not conceding sovereign land legally.
But President Trump seems to think Ukraine might have to make concessions here.
He does seem to lean that way. He explicitly called for talks on possible exchanges of territory, importantly taking into account the current line of contact. And analysts like Jennifer Kavanaugh at Defense Priorities suggest that, yeah, Ukraine will likely have to cede some territory in a final deal. And Crimea, probably not going back to Kyiv.
That's a tough reality. And Europe, on this incredibly sensitive land issue, they seem caught between principles and reality, don't they? How are they navigating that?
It's a really difficult balancing act. European leaders keep saying the principle of territorial integrity must be upheld, in principle. But you also hear some, like Germany's MERS and NATO's route, acknowledging that the front line should be the starting point for territorial negotiations.
So a hint of pragmatism?
Maybe. Or acknowledging reality. They've talked about de facto recognition of Russian occupation perhaps being necessary under certain conditions. But generally, they strongly push back on this idea of territorial exchanges. It's trying to square that circle between international law and the harsh facts on the ground.
Okay, let's shift to security guarantees, that Article 5-like promise. What is Ukraine's ultimate security goal? What do they really want?
Ultimately, Ukraine wants legally binding security guarantees. And their ideal scenario involves membership in both NATO and the EU. Both have these strong collective defense clauses, NATO's famous Article 5, and the EU's Article 42.7, which also obliges aid and assistance, though maybe less automatically military.
And their stance towards Russia is shaped by history.
Completely. Ukraine operates under a no-trust-in-Russia policy. And you can understand why, especially after the 1994 Budapest Memorandum was violated. They gave up nuclear weapons for security assurances that just evaporated.
And Russia's view on Ukraine joining Western clubs?
Still fundamentally opposed. Russia has long seen Ukraine's potential NATO membership as a direct threat, and Moscow keeps bringing up demands for demilitarization and denazification terms. Kyiv rejects as completely baseless pretexts for the invasion.
So what about the U.S. commitment to these potential new guarantees?
President Trump has promised the U.S. will be involved in providing some form of security guarantees. And again, his envoy, Steve Witkoff, called Putin's supposed agreement to Article 5-like protection a game-changing moment. So the U.S. is signaling it's serious about some kind of guarantee structure.
If that Russian agreement is genuine, it really could be pivotal. How have the Europeans reacted to all this talk of Article 5-like guarantees?
By and large, European leaders have welcomed the discussion. France's Macron, for instance, emphasized how important these guarantees are, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole security of the European continent, and for ensuring Ukraine can maintain a credible army long term.
Okay, but despite all this welcoming talk, I still feel like there's a huge amount of ambiguity around what Article 5-like actually means. What does the like really signify?
You've hit the nail on the head. That's the critical point. Ukrainian officials, including Zelensky himself, keep highlighting the lack of details. How would these guarantees work in practice? The like clearly means it's not full NATO Article 5.
So what could it mean? Just money and weapons?
Yeah.
or actual intervention.
Exactly. It could range from immediate military help to just financial aid and arms supplies. Huge questions remain unanswered. What's the exact level of U.S. and European involvement? Would U.S. troops ever be involved? And NATO's own commitment remains vague in invitation when allies agree and conditions are met. That adds another layer of uncertainty for Kyiv.
And this lack of clarity, this ambiguity, it must directly affect Ukraine's sovereignty, right?
Absolutely. If they got robust, legally binding guarantees, that would significantly bolster Ukraine's sovereignty by deterring future attacks. But conversely, vague commitments, or anything that looks like Russia gets an implicit veto over Ukraine's alliances, that could seriously constrain Ukraine's sovereign right to choose its own path. It really gets down to who ultimately decides Ukraine's future.
Which brings us back to that fundamental issue, trust, and the broader political dynamics. Ukraine clearly has very little trust in Russia.
That's putting it mildly. It's a foundational factor here. Ukraine maintains this permanent no trust in Russia policy. The history, especially the Budapest Memorandum failure, makes Kyiv absolutely insistent on guarantees being truly binding, truly enforceable this time. They won't be fooled again, essentially.
But from some angles, trust in the U.S. isn't rock solid either, which must complicate things for Europe.
That's another significant dynamic, yes. There are persistent doubts about the reliability of U.S. commitments, especially under the Trump administration. Some worry a deal made now could be seen as worthless if U.S. politics shift dramatically later.
And Europe's historical position.
Europe has historically relied heavily on U.S. military power, which meant, frankly, underinvestment in its own defense for decades. So now there's this dilemma. Europe needs U.S. involvement, particularly for serious security guarantees, but it's also wary of being seen as just a vassal or having its own specific interests potentially overridden in a U.S.-Russia deal.
These are just monumental issues. Let's look at the roles of the key global players, the architects, if you will. First, the United States, clearly a massive financial and military backer.
Undeniably the leader in security assistance. The U.S. has committed over $52 billion since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. That is a staggering sum. This aid directly helps Ukraine defend itself, and it's also aimed at improving interoperability with NATO forces, making them work better together.
$52 billion. It's hard to even grasp that scale. What forms does that aid take?
It comes through different channels. Over $24 billion via Presidential Drawdown Authority, that's immediate stuff from U.S. stocks. Over $24.9 billion through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative that funds new equipment, training, advice. And over $3.6 billion in foreign military financing.
And what kind of crucial equipment are we talking about?
Really significant hardware. More than 40 HIMARS rocket systems, 12 NASAMS air defense systems, a Patriot battery, 31 Abrams tanks, over 300 Bradley fighting vehicles, plus thousands of anti-aircraft missiles like Stingers and anti-tank javelins. Game-changing stuff, much of it.
Amidst all this aid, what's President Trump's negotiation strategy?
He's consistently prioritized getting a comprehensive peace deal done, maybe even overachieving a ceasefire first. He seems confident about a potential trilateral meeting himself, Putin, Zelensky, and apparently coordination for that is already underway involving Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
But his administration's view on NATO membership for Ukraine is clearly different from Europe's long-standing position.
It is. That's a major point of difference within the alliance. The Trump administration has explicitly ruled out Ukraine joining NATO anytime soon. That contrasts sharply with the European view that Russia shouldn't get a veto over Ukraine's sovereign choices. It creates definite friction, even as they try to work together on a deal.
Okay, let's turn to the European Union and European leaders. They seem set to carry a really significant part of this burden going forward.
Yes, that seems clear. European nations are expected to bear a lot of the burden, especially for these security guarantees. There was even a report suggesting Ukraine offered a massive $100 billion weapons deal financed by Europe as a way to secure those ironclad U.S. guarantees. Shows how much they value them and the scale involved.
And Europe's support has actually been huge already, right? Sometimes even more than the U.S.
That's correct. According to the Kiel Institute, which tracks this closely, European nations maintained really high levels of support, particularly military aid. And about 2 years into the conflict, European aid actually surpassed U.S. aid contributions. It shows a deep, ongoing commitment.
Beyond the military side, what about the absolutely massive task of reconstruction?
The numbers are just mind-boggling. Ukraine's post-war recovery is estimated at U.S. $411 billion. That's twice the country's entire GDP back in 2021. Whether this reconstruction is even feasible, It depends almost entirely on having successful, credible security guarantees in place first. You can't rebuild effectively under constant threat.
And Europe is also pushing for Ukraine to build up its own defense capabilities, not just rely on aid.
Very much so. Europe sees Ukraine developing strong domestic defense capabilities as crucial for its long-term security, especially since full NATO membership seems off the table for now. You see European companies like Germany's Rheinmetall, Britain's BAE Systems already exploring co-production deals, sharing technology with Ukraine's own defense industry.
Ukraine has a history there, doesn't it?
It does. Ukraine's National Recovery Plan highlights developing its defense industrial sector as a strategic imperative. They want to leverage that Soviet-era base.
So diplomatically, what are Europe's main goals in these negotiations?
They want to make sure any U.S. security guarantees are actually credible, not just words. They're still pushing back against forced territorial exchanges, trying to uphold that principle of integrity. And critically, they want to actively influence that potential trilateral meeting. They don't want decisions made over their heads that affect the entire European security order.
Finally, let's consider Ukraine's role. They're increasingly focused on self-reliance, it seems.
Absolutely. Despite all the terrible war damage, Ukraine's own defense industry is still managing to produce munitions and weapons. They're tapping into that history as a major Soviet defense manufacturing hub. It shows incredible resilience.
So they're not just passively receiving aid, they're actively building their own strength.
Exactly. Their leaders see a clear trade-off. The less convincing the external guarantees seem, the more self-sufficient Ukraine will strive to be in defense terms. They're actively seeking those co-production deals and technology sharing arrangements. They know they need their own capacity.
But imagine building that up faces enormous challenges.
Huge challenges. Security is the big one. Any new defense plants could become targets. There are also ongoing governance concerns like corruption, which Ukraine is working on but remains an issue. Then you have export controls from Western partners. They might be hesitant to share the most advanced technology. And even, believe it or not, some allies might worry about Ukraine becoming a future competitor in the global arms market. It's a complex path.
This all seems to be leading towards this potential path ahead, centered on that much-discussed trilateral meeting.
It does seem to be the next major potential step. All three leaders, Trump, Putin, Zelensky, have said they're ready for it. Trump indicated it'll happen if the current talks keep progressing. Interestingly, Macron in France even suggested a quadrilateral summit might be needed after a trilateral one. Who the fourth would be, unclear. But it suggests a potentially multi-stage process.
But getting to a truly stable, lasting peace, that still feels incredibly difficult, doesn't it?
Profoundly difficult. You have those fundamental disagreements on territory and security. You have the deep scars from broken agreements like the Budapest Memorandum. And you have this incredibly complex geopolitical chessboard where every move affects something else. The trust deficit is just enormous. Overcoming that needs, well, unprecedented diplomatic skill and real commitment from everyone involved.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you, our listener? We've definitely seen a sudden surge in diplomatic activity trying to end the Ukraine conflict, but it's driven by this really complex mix of different priorities.
Yeah, the talks are stuck on these incredibly thorny issues. Land, the exact nature of security guarantees, even the basic timing of a ceasefire versus a full peace deal.
The U.S. remains a huge player, committing that massive $52 billion plus in aid since early 2022. But Europe is clearly stepping up, preparing to bear a major share of the security and reconstruction costs going forward.
And it really is this intricate dance, isn't it? Diplomacy, military aid, competing national interests. It all shows that Ukraine's future, and frankly, European security as a whole, really hangs in the balance. It's being shaped as much by today's battle lines as by decades of historical distrust.
So here's something to think about. Given that history, all those violated agreements, and the clearly different motivations driving Russia, Ukraine, the U.S., and Europe, how much can any single game-changing concession, like this talk of Article 5-like protection, truly change the fundamental math of trust and power that's fueled this conflict for so long? What will it actually take to make a peace deal stick this time, to ensure all these massive investments in security and reconstruction aren't ultimately in vain?